We're continuing with the E100, and this week's story comes from the chapters of the prophets, and it's a story of Daniel. The chapter this week is Daniel chapter 6 in its entirety, and the story of Daniel chapter 6 is Daniel in the lion's den. The book of Daniel is it's a great book. It's one of the books that when I was in college, I had gone, my winter break began before my sister. She was in Southwest Missouri State University, and so we didn't get to see or spend much time together, and she said, well, why don't you come to Springfield, Missouri, and we'll have about a week together before we head home for the Christmas holidays and the celebrations. It'll give us a chance to hang out and to get to know one another. And so while we were in Springfield, she said, help me go find a church to get involved with, because it's difficult. If you've been in college, you know how difficult it is to find a home church, a place to belong. Even going to Anderson University, it took until halfway through my sophomore year to find my home church in Anderson. And so I said, yeah, we'll go and do that. And so we went to a Church of God because that's the tradition that we had grown up in and we were familiar with. And we were in the service, and she was fidgety and moving around next to me. And she says, I'm distracted. And so to keep her from embarrassing me, because she was getting to that point, I pulled a Bible out of one of the pews, and I opened up to Daniel, and I said, here, read Daniel. It's a good story. And so she spent the entire service reading through Daniel, and as we left, she says, that's a really good book. And I'm like, yeah, who'd have thunk? It's a great story. The early chapters of Daniel are phenomenal as you look at these young prophets who were in exile. They had been kicked out of Jerusalem. They'd been defeated by the Babylonian Empire and been drug off into exile, the dispersion of the Jews into a foreign land. And so they lived in exile, and these leaders and Daniel had shown their worth through their hard work and through their integrity, that they had earned themselves a place of notoriety, a place of respect. It's a story very similar to Joseph's story in Genesis, where he heads down to Egypt, is sold into Egypt in slavery by his brothers, but because of his principles and his integrity and his faith in God, God puts him in a place of respect and honor. And so this happens with Daniel and some of the other men that he's working with in the foreign land. And then the Babylonian Empire, which was the largest empire in the history of the world, it fell. And it fell to the Persians. And when that happened, the Persian Empire assumed a lot of the leaders that were in the Babylonian Empire and allowed them to stay at somewhat of leadership level. And Daniel was one of those who had been an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, and now he becomes a leader under Darius in the Persian Empire. And Daniel 6 tells the story of the friendship that forms between those two, but then also the manipulation that happens within that political structure of the Persian Empire, where Darius is tricked into issuing a decree that will go against Daniel's faith. And it says, we have just one verse that I want to pull out, Daniel 6, chapter 6, verse 4. It says this, that the other administrators had grown jealous, essentially, of Daniel, and they were trying to figure out a way that they could get him in trouble, trying to blackmail him in some way. And it says this, that he was faithful and always responsible, completely trustworthy. And so then they concluded that our only chance to find grounds for accusing Daniel will be in changing the rules so that it affects his religion. So these advisors go to Darius, and they must have had a really good plan, or Darius was kind of a simple-minded person, one of the two. Seeing that he was the leader of the Persian army, probably not that. They probably had a very good manipulative plan where he puts in this decree that if anyone bows down and worships anyone other than him, they'll be sent off to be executed, particularly into a den of lions. Well, in Daniel's faith, he was faithful in his practices, and he would go daily 3 times and pray to the east, to the rising sun, to the rising star, the morning star, which was a symbol of Yahweh, the God who had walked with his ancestors, and despite being pushed out of Jerusalem, the promised land, Daniel was faithful to this. And so they went and they followed Daniel after this decree was put in place and observed him breaking this law. And they went to Darius and they said, we have someone who's broken this law. And so he was brought up on charges and he's sent to the lion's den. And I'm going to let you finish the story on your own. Those of you who know it, you'll know how this ends. But for those who don't, I'm going to let you go and spend time in this reading and start over from the beginning and read the details of this story. And if you have the time, go back and read the earlier chapters of Daniel and read about what his faith was doing and what he was leading. But this is often the place for us as well in our own faith where it's difficult, and as I was thinking about this message, it's difficult to think about the integrity of my own faith because we live in a very relative world. We're very willing to excuse our practices or our faithfulness. Well, we don't need to do this because we're doing this. And so it's okay if we don't stand up on this principle or stand for this belief. It's okay if we let it slide because we can be faithful in another area or we can be faithful in sacrificing this thing. And so I challenge myself. I'm like, well, how would I look at my own faith and how would I challenge my own integrity of faith and my own willingness to stand my ground and stay principled? And to not waver or to falter despite whatever persecution or hardships or battles, fights, whatever may be coming my way. How would I do that? And to be honest, I wasn't really able to come up with much in the way of integrity. I came across a list of questions that Jesus asked in his ministry. And I read through, there were 300 questions that Jesus asks in his ministry, and some of them, as I read through those, kind of pointed me to that. The things that I'm anxious and I'm worried about are the things that I need to worry about and be anxious about, or the judgment that I hold on to of others that I know I should lay down, because if nothing else, the Lord's Prayer tells us that we should forgive. Forgive those trespasses. Forgive those debtors, those who owe me something. Forgive the sins of others as I want mine to be forgiven. As I read through those questions, I thought, man, I'm not sure where I would stake my integrity. Probably on a scale of 1 to 10, at best, if I'm being generous, maybe sits somewhere in the middle. And no doubt this is the problem and the challenge that the church faces today. I talked last week about Reggie McNeil and the present-future discussions that we've been having at Faith and the desire to help put the church at a place, the bride of Christ, at a place where it's making disciples. Willow Creek, a big church in Chicago, they did a study, a big study where they surveyed over 1,000 churches, looked at what they were doing and how the programs that they were providing and the methods at which they were creating disciples. And they went through this for about 2 years of this survey and interviews and follow-up. And at the end of that 2 years, they stepped back and they said, okay, how is the church making disciples in general? How is the church making disciples? And how good of a job are they doing it? And their conclusion was this: the church is not making disciples, and they're not doing a very good job at doing that as well. So not only are they not doing what Christ has called us to do, is to go into all nations and make disciples, make learners of the way that Jesus taught. Not only are we not doing that, we don't even know how to do that or what we should be doing to do that. In other words, the church is failing at the thing that it's been called and commissioned by Christ to do. And so we've offered for decades, I believe, if not longer, we've offered a product, we've offered this promise to the world and to our members, where we've said, come and we will provide you with programs and it'll fix your life and it'll fix your marriage and it'll fix your debt and it'll fix your family and it'll fix all these things. And then we've not been able to do that. And part of the reason is because that's a promise we shouldn't have made. The life of faith does not fix things. It's not a Band-Aid for life. Instead, we should have been instilling those things that Christ taught. And the things that Christ taught were the things of character, the things of discipline, the things of behavior, the things of action. Unfortunately, the action that we've only asked people to do is to show up to church, to come to a Bible study, to donate some money, to get involved with this thing. And Paul talks about a list, a fruit of the Spirit, where we should be instilling in one another kindness and self-control and patience and long-suffering and endurance. And if we were to step back and say, okay, I have this list of do's, and I may do those, and we may do pretty good at those things. In fact, we may run at a 7 or 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 on how much we do in the name of Christ. But how well are we patient and gracious and long-suffering? And how well do we practice compassion and generosity and sacrifice? And do we do the things that Jesus taught, or do we just talk about Jesus? Last week, my youth pastor from growing up was here with us, Roy, and on Monday he said, I want to speak with you. I want to have a chance to sit down and connect and catch up on life, but I want to hear a little bit about what you're doing in church and in ministry. And in the conversation, we talked about how the church has forgotten why they do what they do. And so we just do things because tradition has prompted us and gotten us to a place where we just do because we do it. And we don't understand the doctrinal or the theological implications of why we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And as he and I were talking, he said, how do you help break those down? How are some of those conversations happening? And I told him some of the conversations we're having at a board level and trying to understand the scorecard that we need to be holding up, the scorecard that we think God's going to hold up at some point and hold us accountable to. And I said, well, at the very basic level, the church gathers on Sunday morning. I said, why do you gather on Sunday morning? I said, why does your church gather on Sunday morning? Why are you there, Roy? And it's the question I started with in the service as I was worship chair last week is, why are you here? On Sunday morning, gathered here, sitting at a table with family or friends or strangers or whatever the case may be, what has brought you here today? And so we have to understand that on an individual level, but then as a church, we have to understand, why are we having this? Why do we set apart our Sunday mornings or Sunday nights or our Saturday nights or whenever a church has its services? Why do we have those services? Why do we need that time? And he says, well, so that the community can gather and sing God's praise. And I said, and what does that mean? And he says, well, so we can sing about what God is doing. And I said, well, then what is God doing? I said, what's God doing in your church? What's God doing in your community? What's God doing in your lives and in your relationships? I said, this is the question we're trying to ask and answer at Faith. And this look of kind of frustration kind of came over, and he said, I can't answer that. And I said, that's often the case with most of us, where we sing praise songs and we sing prayers and we offer this voice, and it's not really our voice, it's the voice of tradition, it's the voice of another generation, it's the voice of some voice of ages past, and no doubt the voice of ages past is important, but we also have to have our own voice and be able to articulate what it is that God is doing in and around us. Can you do that? If I were to ask you, what is it that God is doing in your life? What is it that God is doing in your family? What is it that God is doing in your home? What is it that God is doing in your neighborhood? What is it that God is doing in your workplace? Could you answer any of those questions? And some of us, I imagine, would struggle to answer those. And God's silent or void, or He's not present. And we're waiting for God to show up to do this thing. We read about these miracles in Scripture, and we're waiting for God to show up in this miraculous way. And it's not fair of God. And one reason it's not fair of God, not that God doesn't show up in the miraculous, but we have these stories of miracles in this sacred text, and these stories span over 2,000 years old. And if you were to look at the number of miracles that exist over 2,000 years old, the percentage would be very small. That is not the normal rhythm that God works through. However, the normal rhythm that God works through is through the lives of the people that God is calling to join Him in His work in the world. And so often we say, well, where is God, and where is God, and why isn't God moving, and why isn't He doing this, and how come He's silent? My response is usually, well, why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you being the hands and feet of Christ? Why aren't you showing up and doing this God thing? Why are you waiting? What are you looking for? God's calling for us is not a calling to inaction, but engagement. It's a calling to partnership. It's a calling to involvement. It's a calling to come alongside Him, just as we heard about in the story, that we can't create something out of nothing, but we can create something out of, as the story that Ian shared, out of differences. Isn't that what God and Christ call us to? That all people will someday be able to worship God. Not out of their sameness, but out of their differences. Out of the story that you have of God working in your life. Out of the story that I have of God working in my life. And our worship flows from that because we see God moving, and we want to show up, and we want to speak about the things that we see happening in this God world around us. You see, Daniel saw that, and he was faithful to that. He knew God was working despite the fact that it wasn't the Jewish or the Israelite faith that was controlling things. That the nation had been broken, and that they'd even been kicked out of the promised land that God had given them. And yet Daniel said, God is still in control of all of this, and so I will remain faithful to Him. Who are you having faith conversations with? Who are you nurturing the soil of someone's heart about God's love and compassion? How are you nurturing it in your own life, where you're seeing the movement and the activity of God shape and transform you? Because if you don't see it in your own life, you're not going to see it in the world around you. You're not going to see God move. You're not going to see God act. You're not going to hear God speak because you're not familiar with who God is. And sometimes that takes obligation. A few weeks ago, I was reading in Oswald Chambers' Utmost Forest Highest, and he said that this is the call to drudgery. That faith is not always exciting, that it's not always fun, that it's not always a feel-good moment, but sometimes it's the work of drudgery. It's the hard pull that you have to do to get through and do the things that are necessary, despite the hardships that may come with it. If you've ever lived in a family, and I think most of us probably have here, if you've lived in a family, there are things that you have to do that you don't want to do. There are things that are required that take your energy and take your effort, and they're not always fun and they're not always excitement, but they're necessary. You don't just throw up your hands and walk out and say, it sounds like effort. I'm just going to let it settle down and then I'll come back in. Or it doesn't benefit me, or it doesn't make me feel good, or it steals my energy or my time, or it conflicts with my agenda or my plans, and so, no, it gets put on hold. And we often do that with God. If it creates an inconvenience, if it creates in us a discomfort, if it creates in us a frustration, then we just walk away and we say, no, not until God opens up the heavens and caters to me. Then will I engage in it. I shared last night about how we need to get out of the church building, how we need to move to that place where we partner with God in the world. And I asked you to think about people or persons or groups of persons that you can begin to show hospitality to begin to engage with and share and to begin to look at and dream God's stories. And I encourage you that if you gather that group of people, to let me know that I'll come and help you with that. I'll help you learn how to create a hospital environment, how to share about faith in a way that is real, that is truth and spirit, and that God can be seen and His light can be shown. That we can have the integrity of Daniel in our world, that we know what our convictions are, and our convictions are not to the things that we do, but our convictions are to the character that Christ calls in us to develop in our life. And that we need those disciplines to create that character. And what are those disciplines? How are you creating the things of the fruit of the Spirit mentioned in Galatians 5? How are you fostering character development of the things that Jesus speaks of in the Gospels? It's the conversation I want to have on helping you develop that God character, those God abilities, not so much in the things that you do. The things you do will be motivated by the character you're seeking out to grow and develop in your life. So help us to join in that conversation together. Begin to articulate the things in which God is moving, in which God is creating change and transformation, where God is breaking through lives, where God is disrupting the balance that we often try to create. That's my prayer for you. It's my prayer for us, that we continue to be this change agent where we create something out of the differences that exist. Would you please stand and join me in prayer? Heavenly Father, thank you for gathering us today. May our prayer be, as we started this service, that we may be silent and know you. That you would open our eyes of discernment to see the areas in our life where we need to grow in your character. That we would set aside the list of things to do if they're not motivated by the fruit of the Spirit, by the character that Christ calls us to put on, so that we may have the integrity and the loyalty that Daniel displays in his story and be faithful and true to you. In your name we pray. Amen. My blessing is that God may open your eyes to the transformation and the work that He is doing in and around you. And may He open the doors for hospitality and for friendship to start, that His gospel message of love and grace may be shared. May God be with you. You may go in peace.